IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya, and I'm joined today by Pranav or Satyanath. If some of our listeners don't know who Pranav is, Pranav was a member of the research staff at Takshashila. He left us for higher studies and has now returned back to the fold. Pranav, this is your first All Things Policy episode since you've returned.
Yes, it's my first All Things Policy since I've formally returned, even though by heart and mind I was always with Takshashila.
Absolutely. Welcome back. And, we did, of course, do a few episodes while you were getting your master's degree. And it's really great to have you back once again to discuss all sort of strategic affairs that we would cover on All Things Policy. And of course, what you've been tracking now especially has been space. So what I'd like to talk about is something really interesting that's happened in just the last month. And specifically, this is around military undertakings in space, because last month, a lot of diplomats as well as scholars in space security met in Geneva as part of the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats. Now, the Open-Ended Working Group, or OEWG, was a fairly novel affair as far as space is concerned, because it's an instance of governments from around the world, including those of Russia and several Western states, coming together to discuss military activities in space. In a sense, the OEWG, I think, is a sign of a sort of slow panic that is building up, because states are gradually recognizing that this matters, and we want to figure out what to do about it before something goes very wrong. And the importance of this is quite obvious. We use space for everything, for the cabs we hail and the food we order and the weather forecasts that we depend on and so on. And militaries too, of course, depend on space in very fundamental ways for their operations. So obviously, if an adversary were to challenge your use of space, you could be in serious trouble. Now, the other thing that's happened, of course, is that in the last 15 years, really since 2007, we've seen what I'd call a sort of ASAT renaissance, or anti-satellite missile renaissance. This is not a particularly nice kind of renaissance, but basically we've had a Chinese test in 2007, followed by a sort of American test in 2008. India conducted its own test, Mission Shakti, in 2019, and we have had a destructive Russian ASAT test in 2021. Besides these destructive tests, there have been all sorts of other non-destructive tests of anti-satellite missile capabilities. So that's just one example of the sort of capabilities that states are fine-tuning to challenge the use of space for an adversary. That, of course, that we have to combine that with cyber and electronic warfare threats, so-called rendezvous and proximity operations satellites, and so on. Now, Pranav, you have been tracking the OEWG very closely. Can you, before we get into what was discussed, can you talk about the genesis of the OEWG? How did it come about?
The genesis of the Open-Ended Working Group on Space Threats, in fact, goes back a very, very long time, way before we were actually born, so to say, because since the 1980s, space threats and space weapons have been a genuine problem that countries recognized, which is the reason why at the Conference on Disarmament in the 1980s, you had the Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space, or PEROS, which was an agenda that was created, and an ad hoc work group was created in 1985, which did a very close study on what is arms race in outer space. Since 1985, we have seen a lot of studies on space on reducing space threats. In fact, a lot of the issues that are being discussed today, dual-use technologies, missiles that could be modified as hit-to-kill vehicles in space, all of these were quite substantially discussed in the 1980s and the 1990s. If you go back to the UN website or the UN's research arm, which is called the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, you're going to find a wealth of documents that will make you feel like you're in 2020, even though it was written in 1991. But what, as you mentioned, is that a slow panic would be a very, very right use of the phrase. A slow panic that has set in because we have seen more companies undertake launches. We have satellite constellations that are building up. You have 300, 400 satellites that are used for internet, that are used for providing internet services, that are providing for Earth, that are used for Earth imaging, and having so many satellites and being unable to distinguish between what is a genuine military threat and what is not a genuine military threat certainly sets the mood for the open-ended working group. But to be very specific on how this came about is an undertaking by the European Union and the United Kingdom. In 2012, the Americans were dissatisfied with the state of affairs in space affairs, and some former diplomats and some experts approached members of the European Union and suggested that the European Union should pursue soft law and try to propose a code of conduct, which is how we got the European Union's draft code of conduct in 2012. But this quite didn't work. And after India's ASAT test in 2019 and the Russian ASAT test in 2021, the mood was set. The mood was genuinely set. Not in 2021. The Russian ASAT, sort of the Russian ASAT demonstration way before in 2020 itself set the mood. And the United Kingdom proposed a resolution called the UN resolution 75/36, which set the framework and said, instead of focusing on banning weapons, instead of focusing on trying to preventing an arms race, let's think about responsible and irresponsible behaviors in space. Let's think about measures that can be taken that could genuinely lead to legally binding measures, that a treaty that we can all sign. And this was called as norms, rules, and principles in outer space. So in 2020, in late 2020, many countries in the first committee of the UN proposed this resolution. And in the end of 2021, another resolution was set for, titled UN 76/231, which called upon countries to form an open-ended working group and take this matter very seriously and think and come to a common understanding of what are the threats in space. How do you define a threat? What is responsible behavior? What are the norms that we would all like to see? What are confidence building measures? It's a slow panic that genuinely gave rise to this fact that we're supposed to do something and we need a roadmap for doing something. And the roadmap for doing something was discussed in the OEWG. So it's talking about talking.
Right.
And that's how I would summarize it.
Yeah, no, that's you put it really well, and I'm glad you brought up that a lot of these issues, aren't new. They've been brought up in the 1980s as well. In fact, even if you look at the 1978-79 ASAT missile negotiations, which failed, it's quite remarkable that you see many of the same topics that we're discussing being discussed then. It's just that a lot of them simply become more salient today because we use space for everything. Now, the other thing I found really interesting is, as you pointed out, we're not looking at, for example, traditional arms control along the lines of Paros over here. We're looking at basically trying to codify behavior in space. So what's interesting is, one, that states are trying to define what exactly constitutes responsible behavior, and there doesn't seem to be agreement on that, naturally. And secondly, there is also very clear, very evident debate about how much of this should be legally codified and how much of it should just be a series of norms that we put forth. I've also seen in the OEWG some very interesting discussions, for example, of whether international humanitarian law should apply in space. By actually employing IHL in space, do you actually make it a space for warfighting, or do you actually simply codify behavior there and actually make the world safer? Can you talk us through some of the issues that have been discussed in the OEWG and some of the themes that have emerged?
Yeah. Before I go, I just want to say that a lot of the themes are legacies of the positions that countries have adopted previously. In some areas, such as the European Union, the countries in the European Union, we have seen some change. But if you look at Russia and China, these camps are the statements they've put out, and the position they've taken is a throwback to the same position they held in 2009 and 2014. And I'll elaborate on these. So we can divide the issues discussed in the open-ended working group into 3 or 4 categories. The first would be, what kind of things should we regulate? Should we regulate physical hardware or capabilities? Or should we regulate behaviors? And to a very large extent, almost all countries agree that you cannot control capabilities because of the dual use nature and because of the sensitivity of going and inspecting satellites. So therefore, they've said it's better to control behaviors rather than control physical capabilities. It's not a unanimous consensus, but it is a majority consensus. That it's not a unanimous consensus, but rather a majority agreement that we must have behavioral approaches to negotiations rather than banning capabilities like traditional bilateral arms control. The second issue is whether it should be legally binding or non-legally binding. The camp on the European Union side and some South American countries have come to the conclusion that it is far better to have non-legally binding instruments, that is, agreed principles, codes of conduct, transparency measures, politically binding measures. That is, it's not legally codified, but it's a political undertaking, or that you tell other countries that you will politically be responsible for certain actions. These measures are far more easily applicable, or as the European Union and the UK would put it, it's the most pragmatic approach to take at the moment, right? So they believe that establishing principles and testing the grounds on how these principles work will lead to a legal agreement that could be refined in the future, right? The second one is the second group. The second set of issues here is India is whether how do you define a space threat? As much as it might be trivial that what is a threat, right? It's very simple. If you feel that your satellite is going to be destroyed, then you feel like it's a threat. But defining a threat is far more difficult because if a country deploys, say, a satellite that can perform rendezvous and proximity operations or provide on-space repairs and services, such would be not taken. It will not be taken as a threat by many countries, but some may see that close approaches might seriously be something of military nature, which is what also that you have written. So defining a threat, whether it's a readiness, it's like whether it's a series of close approaches, whether it's a single close approach, we don't know. So defining the space threat is very important, and this is the second contention. There is no definition of how you consider a threat. Finally, the third issue is where these issues should be discussed. As I mentioned, Paros has been a long time agenda in the Conference on Disarmament, and reducing space threats has always been considered something akin to consensus in the CD rather than being in the UN First Committee, which is up for majority vote. So the second issue is where should these issues be taken forward, and what should be kept out? Space and debris is certainly a threat, but is it a military threat? We don't know. It's a civilian threat for sure, because space debris can cause your satellites to malfunction. It can cause your satellites to not function at all. But is it really a military threat? It's also a military threat because some countries may deliberately create debris to disrupt the operations of other countries. So how do you delineate between sustainability of space activities and security of space for military activities and security of space against military threats? These are the final set of issues that are in very, very hot contention. Based on these, we don't see much agreement at all. I find about three camps there. The first camp is the European Union camp, which is largely in agreement, although not in complete agreement, about what is a space threat, what is dual use, how should you approach space with regard to humanitarian law and existing laws of armed conflict. Next is the China-Russia camp, which in 2009 tabled the treaty known as PPWT, Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. I'm getting the name wrong. It's quite a mouthful, but it's called PPWT. And it essentially says we should ban the placement of weapons in space. We should control missile defenses. So it's both of behaviors and physical capabilities. But as we know, the United States has refused to have anything to do with missile defenses, any talks about reducing missile defense capabilities. So for Russia and China, this is clearly targeted against US missile defenses. So it's likely to not go anywhere. The third one, as I call the rest of the world camp, which is not really settled on what they want. They would like to see legally binding instruments. India, for example, would like to see legally binding instruments. Cuba and other countries in South America would like to see legally binding instruments, but they're not really settled on how do you approach non-legally binding instruments. And they haven't made many statements either. These are the three camps, and we are in hot contention. But what is agreed, what is a long-term vision that all countries agree is that we need legally binding instruments. We can't simply do with not having anything or simply going about rules of the road and have something that's on paper, that's codified, and that can be held accountable in the international law.
Yeah, I think this is a debate where we're going to see the fault lines sharpen, and it's going to be interesting to see where we actually find some convergence. Pranav, let's get back to discussing arms control itself and why it's not feasible, as well as your concluding thoughts on this subject. We'll discuss these issues after a quick break.
Hello, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcasts Network. On the Filter Coffee podcast, India Film Project founder Ritam Bhatnagar shares his thoughts on the creator movement with Karthik. On the Wire Talks, Siddharth and Professor Sasanka Pereira talk about the current crisis in Sri Lanka. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explores the two different approaches to management, top-down and bottom-up. On Say No to Drama, Chetna explains how spirituality is not devoid of logic. And on Marathi Khidkitun, the Deshmukhs admire the works of multifaceted Marathi author Gopal Neelkant Dandekar. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcasts has just launched its merch, and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcasts website and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. We're also doing a small listener survey to better understand how you respond to our shows and advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It helps us build better shows for you. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, Capgemini, get the future you want, Intel V Pro, built for business, and Intel, future banao wonderful with Intel-powered laptops.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. Now, Pranav, one issue or theme that we've seen recurring is responsible behavior. This is what we flagged at the beginning. States don't seem to agree on this. And this, of course, has direct implications for arms control, both for capabilities and for behavior. Can you tell us what this debate is about and what camps do states fall into?
Responsible behaviors, and this is the main agenda of the OEWG, to discuss what are responsible behaviors. And the European Union and the United Kingdom have a set definition of what is irresponsible and what is responsible. This is held to a country's intention, not only the intention of how they plan to use their space-based capabilities, but also the outcome of those intentions, right? Irresponsible behavior is non-consensual approaches of satellites towards the satellites of particular organizations or countries. Some of these are classified as irresponsible, but there's no definition of the threshold to which it can go to become irresponsible. And this is where I have my personal contention with looking at responsible and irresponsible behaviors. Similar to contentions of what China and Russia have expressed, that this black and white image of either you're responsible or irresponsible out of intent could be used as a political tool and could be weaponized to sort of name and shame other countries. For most of the Western countries, this is the intent. It is by having rules of responsible and irresponsible behavior, you get to name and shame. This creates a norm of being in line with what is responsible rather than being called out for being irresponsible. And the legal contention is that what is the precedence does one country have to say you are irresponsible? You are not being a good nation. So that has no legal bearing as of yet. And it's very difficult for countries to agree on something, you universally agree on principles and say we are being very responsible, because sometimes countries may not have the intent to perform such behaviors, but may certainly perform such behaviors in such a way that it could be seen as threatening. And I find it very, very difficult going forward if countries don't agree on something less, something that can be less contentious, something that can be less, something that sounds less menacing. Responsible behavior it sounds very adversarial. And unless and until countries come up with at least a term or at least a set of terms that are not so adversarial, we perhaps could see some agreements on what is good behavior, or what is considered to be as, I wouldn't say responsible, but and then let's see something more on the Atkins lines of acceptable behavior. That would be interesting to see whether how would you change these phrases into something more acceptable. But I don't see any arms control in physical capabilities as well. You have written extensively about this in covering in Takshashila's newsletters also. So you and I very well know that getting arms control on physical capabilities is almost impossible, except for the fact that we can have test bans without any form of verification, or verification that some countries can perform while other countries can't. Those are my thoughts. And I did leave out 20 countries. I left out Japan, I left out South Korea. These are countries that have expressed important views. These are countries that have expressed support for the behavioral approach, the non-legally binding approach. But their definition of space threats, their definition of what is considered to be a responsible behavior is very different from those of the European countries.
Yeah, the other country that I think we've left out because we've had to, Pranav, is actually India, because we've not seen very active Indian participation in the OEWG, or in the talks about talks leading to the OEWG, which are itself talks about talks. But as roundabout as these negotiations might seem, they are important, and they are going to have serious implications for our strategic environment. And I think it's a subject that we will need to continue discussing. We will continue bringing up these issues in our newsletter, Technopolitic, which comes out every fortnight. We will also be doing more episodes of All Things Policy. We'll be writing op-eds on the issue. And we will be coming out soon with a research document specifically on the OEWG. So, Pranav, thank you so much for joining us on All Things Policy, and thank you so much for tracking the subject so closely and so skillfully.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya, for also being a great host and also being my close friend and colleague, tracking the same set of issues. So we are perhaps the only two people who have such an interest in such boring roundabout matters.
Yeah, we are. I assure you, most of our colleagues definitely mock us behind our back, but it's good fun. All right. Once again, thank you so much, Pranav, and thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST, or our website, takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people, and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.